Hello and welcome to our first in a long series of talks with politicians, academics, and businessmen and women, brought to you by the Atlantic Council of Canada. I'm Alexander Corbet, and my guest today is an expert on international aid and development, holds a doctorate and an MPhil from the Institute of Development Studies and a BA from Harvard. He's also an associate professor at the University of Toronto. Thank you for being with me today, Professor WIlson Prichard.
Pleasure.
Our first question is a general overview. Can you outline the core issues with the current international aid system for our viewers?
Yeah, I think the best way to answer that question is to focus on what I think the big question is that everyone's asking about the aid system. And I think the big question that everyone's asking is, why has aid not been more effective than it has been? Because I think over the past 10 years in particular, there have been more and more studies of the effectiveness of aid. And obviously it's very hard to figure out exactly how effective aid has been. But I think the bottom line from those studies is, on the one hand, there have been some real successes. And I think it's important to remember that, right? Aid hasn't been an unmitigated disaster. Lots of good things have happened. We have libraries full of successful projects providing health, providing education, helping in post-conflict environments, and so on. And I don't think we want to lose sight of those successes, but at the same time, it's clear that aid hasn't been as effective as, in some ways, it's been promised. And that's true in the sense that there are lots of countries that have received aid for a long time without experiencing the type of rapid development that's been promised. I think it's also true in the sense that we still see lots of projects on the ground that aren't delivering the results that they're meant to. And so the question is, why is that? And for me, there are all kinds of different answers to that question. But I sort of focus in on two that I think are particularly important, and in some ways particularly amenable to intervention, to being improved over time. And the first one is, I think, the behavior of donors themselves. And it's disappointing to say, but I think the reality is that our donor agencies could do a lot of things better, know that they could do them better, but nonetheless don't do them better. And that's obviously a bit troubling, but it also means that it's something that can be fixed. I think in some ways it's about not using the best research and about best lessons from the ground in the design of donor programs at the center. And so we can see that, the traditional example is the idea of tile aid. And so donors will provide aid programs, but only when they're provided by organizations or companies from the home country. And on the one hand, you can see why that's true, right? Donors want to support firms in their home country. But that's not necessarily the best thing for recipients. But I think we can see a lot more examples that follow a similar trend. There's a lot of evidence now that donor programs would be best implemented in a decentralized fashion. Right? You give decision-making power down to the local level because that allows you to have projects that are locally targeted, locally tailored, context appropriate. But in practice, donors are centralizing decision-making, keeping those decisions at the center. Donors are notorious for not monitoring and evaluating their programs effectively. And again, we can understand why that is, right? No donor wants to come back to its taxpayers and say, we've done all these programs and they didn't work. But the reality is, if you're not willing to admit failure, you can't learn. So in that sense, I think there are a lot of things donors could easily do that would make things better quite immediately. And we know what those things are, but they're politically difficult. And so the question is, how do you get a constituency to push for change? I think the second side of this coin is very different. And it focuses on how we think about the challenge of development, how we think about the types of interventions that might be appropriate, the role that donors can play. And here I think the big buzzword in development has been ownership and local country ownership. And there's been this acknowledgement that at the end of the day, development projects will only succeed if there's real political leadership in the countries themselves. I think that's a really important lesson. It runs to the core of development, because the reality is we have 40 years of programs where there's not local political leadership, you don't get good, positive outcomes, because there is no political support for these things. But the question then is, what does that really mean in practice? If we accept that you need local ownership, local leadership, what does that mean for the way that donors function in practice? I think that's a really hard question, because it's sort of easy to say. It's easy to say, it's owned by the recipient. They wrote the plan. But of course, you know as well as I do that if I say to you, you write the plan of what you want to do, but I'll only fund it if you do certain types of things, well, you're going to do the types of things that I want you to do. And that's not real ownership. And so, the question that's sort of the center of a lot of my work is, how do you create an aid system in which you do have real leadership, real agenda setting by recipient countries, and where the role of donors then is to support and to foster positive political processes within recipient countries to deliver better development outcomes. And so to me, in the big picture, I think those are the big challenges facing the industry. How do you make donor agencies function better? Often in ways that we know are necessary. And second, how do we continue to rethink the way that we deliberate, what it means to have local ownership, and what the role of donors then is in fostering positive political processes locally?
Thank you. Given your specialization on Sub-Saharan Africa, how do these dynamics affect countries in the region?
Well, to answer that question, let me maybe take a step back and to say a bit about how I've focused my research. Because at some level, this question of what does it mean to have local ownership and local leadership of development projects is it's a huge question. It's
a very difficult one as well.
And so my work has been actually focused on picking up one part of that question, one part of that challenge, and seeing what we can do with it. And the starting point for me has been to actually look at the revenue basis of governments, right? So where governments get their money from. And the rationale behind that kind of an approach has been very simple, and that is where governments get their money from is likely to have big implications for how they then govern. And maybe even more importantly, when governments tax their citizens, that's at the very core of the relationship between governments and their citizens, right? And if we're interested in fostering environments in developing countries where governments are genuinely accountable and thus genuinely willing to take a leadership role in providing positive development outcomes, we have to think about how you foster a more productive relationship. And for me, taxation and revenues are at the center of that. And so my research is sort of focused on the two sides of that equation. On the one hand, how do you foster tax systems in developing countries that will encourage a more productive process of bargaining between citizens and their governments? Based on the idea that if governments are taxing more, if they're taxing in a way that's transparent, that's relatively inclusive, that's relatively egalitarian, then that will create incentives for citizens to hold those governments to account. So that's been one part of my research. The other part of that research has been on the sort of negative side of the coin, and that is what happens when governments don't get all of their revenue from taxing their citizens, but instead get their money from oil wealth, mineral wealth, and so on. And in those cases, we see something very different. And this is relatively well known to folks who study development, and it's the idea of a resource curse, which is, in principle, we would think discovering oil is a great thing if you're a developing country. Suddenly, you're richer, you can invest in social services and infrastructure. The reality we've seen in practice is that's often not the case. Instead, you discover oil, and suddenly your country's getting poorer. At least most people in your country are getting worse off. You're getting less democratic, more corrupt, less engaged with your citizenry. But again, it comes back to the same basic idea, that if the government isn't engaged in this process of bargaining with its citizens, but instead is getting a lot of its money externally from oil, from minerals, then there may be less incentive to be engaged. So what does this then mean, to answer your question more directly, for African countries themselves? And I think it means a couple of things. One is we have to think about what happens on a continent where such a large number of countries do get a lot of their revenue from natural resource wealth. Because there are a huge number of countries in Africa that are massively dependent on oil revenue. And many of those countries are not terribly well governed. You can think of an Angola or a Nigeria. These are sort of classic examples that people cite when they think about the idea of a resource curse. And so in those contexts, what then can we, as external agents, do to try to encourage better outcomes in those settings? The other side of my research has been to say, just as we want to mitigate the negative effects of resource wealth, what if we look at the other side? What if we look at the tax side? How can we foster productive bargaining between citizens and their governments, centered on the question of revenue and centered on the budgeting process? And in that context, I think there is a positive role that donors can play in helping countries to build stronger tax systems and helping them to build tax systems that are relatively inclusive and transparent and so forth. And so my research points to various examples of where these things are happening and trying to identify the positive lessons in places where donors can play a useful role.
Very interesting. Can you give us any specific examples for the viewers?
Okay, well, let me again take that question on from sort of the negative side and then from the positive side. Trying to look at this, the idea of fostering positive political linkages through taxation, and then how you deal with the potentially negative effects of resource wealth. And starting on the taxation side, so starting on the sort of positive side of the story. I mean, my favorite story about this kind of process comes from Ghana. And for those who don't know Ghana very well, I mean, the broad background is that Ghana was one of the first independent nations in Africa, and in that sense was a great success story on the continent, and a country to which many people looked as an example of what Africa could become after independence. But by the 1970s, it had fallen into economic crisis. We had a series of military coups, and at the beginning of the 80s, a new president comes to power, again through military coup. His name is Jerry Rawlings. And during the 80s, he remains essentially at the head of a one-party state. You have some economic recovery, but still very little political space for participation. In 1992, they hold preliminary elections, but the opposition complains that the elections are flawed. They boycott parliament. And so even by the mid-90s, you're still in this position where there's been an election, but effectively there's still very little political space. The opposition is out in the streets protesting. And so the question is, where are we going to find that opening? Where are we going to find that political space where you begin to have a public that's able to more actively engage with government and more actively able to demand accountability? And in this case, we find that the spark that makes that happen is taxation. And the story here is that the government in 1995, with the support of international donors to say, there is an international role here, decides to introduce a new sales tax, a value-added tax. And when they go to introduce this value-added tax, their assumption is this is going to be really smooth, easy. No one in this country is going to protest against this government. But days after they try to introduce this new tax, you have tens of thousands of people in the streets protesting against this tax. At the end of the day, the government is then forced to repeal the tax. But more importantly than that, those protests send a message, right? Because there have been no mass protests like this in Ghana for 15 years. But the day those protests started, the political leadership said to themselves, the political climate is changing. What we need to do as a political leadership is changing. We need to bring the opposition into parliament. We need to open more political space for citizens to have a role in governance. And of course, this is just a first step, but it opened a door. In 1996, you then have much more open, much more free elections. The opposition comes into parliament. And since then, Ghana has been the most democratic country on the continent in some respects. And so, again, this isn't a story just about tax, right? The protests weren't just about tax. But the point is that when the government went to tax its citizens, that opened a space for citizens to then make reciprocal demands on its government. And that became a catalyst for political change, right? It doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it's an example to me of the ways in which donors and national governments on their own can seek to foster more productive political engagement and bargaining between citizens and governments. Because that's going to be at the foundation of fostering the positive political dynamics that will underpin good development outcomes. So that's the sort of positive kind of story. And while it doesn't necessarily have to be tax, and it's an example of the types of things I think donors should be trying to do. On the negative side is then, what do you do about the problem of the resource curse? Right? If you know that big discoveries of oil frequently, not always, but frequently lead to paradoxically negative outcomes, what can the international community do to try to deal with that problem? And I think there are two ways of thinking of it. One way of thinking about it is to think about national reform, right? Work with those governments to try to put in place greater transparency, stronger institutions to limit opportunities for corruption and so forth. And I think that's really desirable, that's really important, and donors can play a role there. The trouble is, of course, donors are trying to get these governments to do it, knowing that those governments are precisely the people that might not have an interest in those kinds of measures. So the alternative is, what else can donors do? If you have a government that isn't receptive to reform proposals, how can you nonetheless contribute to reform? And I think the lesson from the case of the resource curse is you can also look outside of the country and look at how a broader set of international policies beyond development assistance per se may shape the incentive environment, may shape the way that politics plays out in developing countries. And so in the case of the resource curse, we have a range of initiatives. We have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. There's been an international initiative to try to get governments and resource companies to publish more information more transparently about how much money they're collecting and how that money is being used. The Kimberley process was a process put in place with the support of the UN to certify diamonds being traded out of conflict areas, to ensure that diamonds from conflict areas weren't financing civil wars, as they were in Liberia and Sierra Leone in particular. A third example are efforts to put pressure on mining companies and oil companies in particular to behave better in the developing countries in which they operate, right? So making sure that companies housed in your country aren't paying bribes, that they aren't engaging in mining activities in conflict areas and potentially fueling conflict. Right? All of these things are things that are very much under the control of donor countries, but they're not about foreign aid, but they're very much about development. I think too often we think about development just as being about foreign aid, but not about the broader sets of policies that our governments undertake, which may shape development outcomes in recipient countries. And I think looking at governance through the lens of revenue allows us to see some examples of those types of policies.
Given that the public discussion has revolved around Dambisa Moyo's neoliberal approach in debt aid and Samantha Nutt's societal-based initiatives outlined in Debt Nations, what are the steps that you believe are necessary to alleviate the current aid crisis?
Well, I guess in order to answer that question, let me just say a few things about both of those books. I think, in broad terms, my answer is I think there are grains of truth in both books, but I think they don't tell a complete story. In the case of Dambisa Moyo's book, I think she does raise some important issues, right? She alerts us to the fact that development assistance is not always going to be positive, and particularly for political reasons, right? The type of political reasons I'm describing. She argues aid might promote dependency. Aid may lead governments to respond to donor demands, not to the demands of their citizens. Aid may fuel corruption or even conflict in the worst cases. And I think all of those things are potentially true, right? We as an aid-giving community need to be thinking about the potentially unintended consequences of aid. And she alerts us to that. I think that's positive. But at the end of the day, I think her argument, which ultimately sort of dismisses aid as something that can never be effective, can never be useful, is counterproductive. And it's really overblown. And in part that's because she too readily ignores, I think, the positive achievements of aid that I mentioned at the outset, right? Aid has been successful in many places in providing social services, in raising schooling, in raising health outcomes, in contributing to rebuilding in post-conflict settings. And we shouldn't dismiss those so easily. I think the other weakness of her book is she doesn't necessarily offer an alternative, right? She sort of promises us if we just all left these countries alone, things would work out. But I think we know that it's not necessarily so simple. Right? Not all leaders in all developing countries are necessarily committed to development outcomes. That's not to say that they're all corrupt, but we should neither assume that they're all corrupt nor that they're all committed to the best possible outcomes. And the idea that there's no role for outside forces to play in trying to foster positive dynamics, in trying to support positive reformers, seems to me a bit too naive and a bit too easily dismissive of the role of Western powers. So that's one side. Turning to Samantha Nutt, again, I think there's a really important role for non-governmental organizations to play in development. I think we see that on the ground. I don't think anyone would dispute that broad claim. I think on the one hand, non-governmental organizations have been hugely important in providing services, particularly in places where the state isn't operational, in conflict environments, in post-conflict environments. And that's obviously hugely important from a humanitarian perspective. I think equally, if we see aided through this more political lens, non-governmental organizations can play a crucial role in fostering positive political processes, in putting pressure on governments locally to provide better development outputs. And I think that also is hugely important. I think that's something we talk less about. Right? When we support NGOs, it's often to provide services, thinking less about the political implications of building strong civil society. I think that's really important. But I think we also have to be realistic about how far that can take us. At the end of the day, positive development outcomes across developing countries demand that we have states that are capable of delivering good services, capable of creating opportunity, capable of genuinely representing their citizens. NGOs can be a stepping stone to that goal, but they can't ultimately replace that goal. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, when supporting NGOs, which I think we should, how are they contributing to that longer term goal? And making sure that we're not supporting NGOs in a way that bypasses the state or sidelines it. Because if we do that over the long term, I think we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot, much in the way that someone like Dambisa Moyo is arguing. And so I think in both of those cases, the question is, how do you take the lessons without taking them to extreme? Sitting where I'm sitting, the big message is, let's think about the unintended consequences of aid. Let's think about the role of civil society in generating positive incentives for local governments to lead development efforts in their own countries. But let's not lose sight of the importance of the state. Let's not lose sight of the role that external actors can play in supporting those processes, right? Not in providing a blueprint for development, but in supporting positive political processes in developing countries, and the role of international actors in setting up an international environment that's supportive of processes going on in developing countries. And again, I think that's a piece of development we don't talk enough about, and that we should talk about more.
It seems that in recent years, international aid has become a focal point of discussion, one which was previously untouched by the realm of public debate. What do you think caused this paradigm shift?
Well, I'd say that's a very complicated question. I'm not the expert, right? And I don't think anyone could say for sure what's happened. But I think a couple things are at least sort of worth drawing attention to. I think one is the obvious that, through the internet, through the expansion of global media, we have more and more access to information about the rest of the world. And I suspect that that's part of our story, is that people are ever more aware of what's going on in the rest of the world. I think positively, hopefully, then are concerned about what our governments are doing in those parts of the world. And recognizing that these are some of the great challenges facing the world, and ones around which we should be thinking about how we can contribute positively. I think the second thing, and maybe less positive, is I think the financial crisis and more broadly sort of fiscal challenges facing a lot of Western states is causing people to think very hard about how we're spending government money. And I think that some of that also is a positive process. One of the problems for aid is I think people think that we spend much more money on aid than we actually do. I know the surveys in the US suggest that people think that we spend as much as 10 times as much or 20 times as much as is actually spent on international assistance. And so in times of budget crunches, those people are saying, well, we could just cut down on that massive foreign aid budget and that would solve our problem. And I think the reality, though, is actually cutting the aid budget doesn't solve your fiscal crisis. Instead, it just means abandoning the small amounts of money you're spending on some of the world's most important issues. But I think that's a real challenge facing all of us, is how to make sure that fiscal pressures at home don't lead us to abandon these important goals overseas, or alternatively, and I think this is a real challenge for donors, as there's pressure for the public for accountability in the way aid money is spent, that doesn't lead to perverse outcomes. That doesn't lead donors to centralize their operations. That doesn't lead donors towards central planning. Because as I said at the outset, right? If you believe that development efforts need to be locally owned and locally led, the centralization of activities is antithetical to that. And so while you can understand why a government facing fiscal pressure might want to centralize operations, the reality is we need to keep having a discussion about these issues and keep putting pressure for development policies that are targeted at getting the best development outcomes, not simply responding to short-term political calculations.
Perfect. Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. Return back to the ACC at www.atlantic-council.ca for more upcoming interviews. And again, thank you for watching.